I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. She is my feature author of the month of February, award winning and best selling author, no other than Miss Raven Oak.
Hi. Like I said last time, I'm a science fiction and fantasy author out of the Seattle area, and I am a word geek, meaning that I absolutely love to study the history and etymology and linguistics of words.
Yes, definitely. So, Miss Raven Oak, thank you so much for sharing your talents to the world. We are looking for more award-winning and best-selling things. So, what one of your book that we're gonna talk about today?
Yeah, we're going to talk about Amaskan's Blood. It is book one in my Boahim trilogy. It's probably my most known work, and the trilogy will be finished this year on the series 10-year anniversary. But yeah, it's definitely my most award winning book as well. And so, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that today.
Definitely. So, what are the central themes of Amaskan's Blood, and how are they woven into the narrative?
Well, Amaskan's Blood is my most personal work in terms of fiction, which is to say that I was discovering my own history and my own family in a side of my family I didn't really know at the time that I was writing this. And so, one of the main themes of this series is the idea of our birth families versus our chosen or found families, and what that would look like in a fantasy world.
So, how does the protagonist develop as a character throughout the story?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Like a lot of epic fantasies, there are multiple point of view characters, and the main focus is Adelei, but there's also another character in Margaret, who is her sister, and they have not been a part of each other's lives in this story until this story happens. So growing up, they were apart. Adelei is this very strong person in that she's an Amaskan, and in this world, you can kind of think of them like half monk, holy order, and half assassin. So her job is to actually go out and kill people who are evil. They only kill specific people. So she has this tenet that she believes, and she has this idea of what justice is. And then her sister is this princess who's spoiled and has no idea of what the real world is like. And in very bizarre ways, when I'm writing it, these two characters kind of do a little bit of a switch in that Adeline learns what it is to serve others and not necessarily her holy order. She learns what it is to be part of a family that is, again, not part of a religious idea. And her sister learns some hard truths about the world out there and what it was like for her sister to grow up. And so they learn from each other. And in that, that's part of that character development that I think a lot of people identify with, because we're constantly being introduced to different people that have different ideas than ourselves. And how do you marry that with your own ideas?
Interesting. Miss Raven, interesting indeed. So, what role does the concept of identity play in Adelaide's journey?
Well, I mean, she spent 18 years growing up into the idea of serving the gods, serving justice, and going out there and basically murdering for hire for people who needed somebody to get them justice. Um, and so she thinks she has it all figured out. But as she's going through the events of the book, she realizes there's so much she doesn't know. There is so much out there to still learn, and her identity is constantly changing. What she thought were truths about her birth family weren't truths at all. The people she thought were her chosen family were lying to her to some degree. And so she's constantly trying to figure out where she fits in the world and what that looks like going forward.
So, Miss Raven, how does the relationship between Adelei and her family shape the story?
Well, I mean, this at the core, for all that there are all of these different events going on, and it's typical epic fantasy and having intrigue. Her story with her families, that is the story. You don't really have any of this mattering unless you're focusing on, again, her relationship with her chosen family versus her birth family, and the ever changing course that happens throughout the story with that.
So, what is the significance of the Amaskans and how do they impact the world of Bohemian trilogy?
Boahim. hmm so when I was developing this, the idea is that there used to be this continent used to be known as the Kingdom of Boahim, and like a lot of civilizations, there was a period of unrest, and during that period of unrest, the people fought and were like, we don't want to be ruled by you anymore. And Boahim broke into 12 different kingdoms. And so we then saw the rise basically of 12 different countries. Those countries became known as the Little Dozen Kingdoms. And in that, you have this focus on whether or not kings were really helping everybody. With a lot of monarchies, um, kingdoms, and things of that nature tend to focus on the wealthy, the people of power, nobility. But if you have, some guy who makes shoes for a living over here and his daughter is murdered, who gets justice for him? Who makes sure that the bad guys pay? At the time that I was thinking about this, I was going through another watch of the TV show Leverage, and
Yes.
they are a bunch of criminals who do heists to basically get justice for, well, the people who laws don't fit. And that was kind of the inspiration for the Amaskans. They wanted to be able to be hired by anybody, whether you had the money to pay them or not, for them to get justice, to serve the god Anur, who is the god of justice in this world, and to make sure that, you didn't have to have a king in your pocket and on retainer to make sure that bad guys were punished.
Certainly. So, how did you balance action, character development, and the world building?
We talked about this a little bit in the first episode, and if you haven't listened to the first episode, go listen to it. Quick
Yes.
plug. But the idea of scene and sequel, again, that idea that if an event happens, you need space for your characters to react, to breathe, to respond to it, even if it's not a physical response, even an emotional response. And that's going to guide their next goal or their next task. And as
Yes.
long as I'm giving space for my characters to respond to what's happening to them, particularly emotionally, I feel that that does balance not just tension, but again, action versus your character development.
So, what challenges does Adelai face as she navigates her role as both an Amaskan and a member of her family?
Well, I mean, she is 19 in book one. And while I did not write this specifically to be young adult, she does have some of the same conflicts that a 19-year-old would have. She's been raised to be a Amaskan, and so she's probably a lot more wise and older mentally than a 19-year-old, but she's still a 19-year-old. She still wants to have a family and be loved and all of the things that come with being a new adult. Um, and so, she has some of those conflicts. She also has the conflict of discovering that magic is alive. For a good chunk of the book, they think magic isn't really a thing anymore, that it died off long ago. And to discover that there are people out there doing some very evil things with magic is startling. It's concerning, and it does rock the very core of a lot of her beliefs. And so she definitely has those kinds of struggles in addition to all of the familial tension.
Very well said. Ms. Raven, beautifully articulated. And how does the political intrigue in the story affect the plot and the characters?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell a story about, I guess, people in power without having intrigue. And so, there's definitely a lot of the tension that comes with people who are in the place of ruling and maybe don't want to rule, or people who, um, have places of power and privilege and aren't sure how to even use that. And so, Margaret, she just wants to sit in the corner and look pretty at the beginning of the story. That changes as you go throughout the book, but at the beginning she's quite content to not have to do much of anything and not think much at all. And so you have to you have to build in some of that conflict when you're dealing with characters that are in places of privilege, I think. And so I really, again, with the two characters kind of learning from each other and shifting, I wanted them to be able to do that because I didn't want this to be another story where there's a spoiled princess who never learns any lessons. I really wanted her to be able to come into her own and to be able to have a place of power that is well earned, and Margaret has to work for it. And at the same time, Adelei learns how to relax a little and not always be thinking about the job, and that's well earned as well.
Definitely. So, how does the setting contribute the tone and atmosphere of the story?
Well, when I was beginning to build this world, because it is 12 kingdoms, I wanted each kingdom to have its own distinct feel, its own culture. And so I did a lot of world building before I was even writing. And like Tolkien, being somebody with a background in linguistics, I did look at, um, you know, if the language base for the kingdom of Sadai is, Hebrew based,
Yes,
then I want to make sure that the culture reflects that because our culture impacts our language. In the United States, we're called a melting pot because we have all these different cultures that come in, and that's why you have a lot of different holidays that gets celebrated here that may or may not have even originated here. I mean, none of them really did. Um, and so I wanted to be able to reflect that in those kingdoms, and so I was very careful with this world. This kingdom in particular may have a architecture base that looks like what you would see in the Middle East. I did not want to make it the Middle East. It's not. It's a fantasy world. But I did want to be able to show that all these places are influenced by other places because that's what happens in the world. Somebody travels to another country and tells about this, and then that influences this little pocket, and it that influence sometimes grows, and that's what world building looks like in reality. And so that's what I tried to do with the fictional side of that as well.
definitely. Interesting, Miss Raven. So, how are the antagonists portrayed, and what motivates their actions?
The protagonist in Amaskan's Blood is a little different from the protagonist in book two and thus in book three. But in book one, there are multiple antagonists, some of which are not necessarily people. There is one central character who he's one of those types who wants to rule the world. He would love to unite Boahim again, but under his rule. And so, he's trying to marry into a kingdom because he thinks it will gain him the military he needs to basically take over. And so, that's one of the antagonists. There's also the antagonists, again, of the Amaskans themselves. They're held up to be this very holy order that does a really horrible thing by murdering people. But are they really that good? Are they potentially the enemies? And so there's a lot of those kinds of questions that Adelei is trying to figure out that build in some world and emotional antagonists as well.
So, what are the key relationships in the story, and how do they evolve over time?
Well, I mean, there's Adeline and her sister Margaret, and we've talked a bit about how they kind of learn from each other and flip around a bit. But there's also the relationship between Adeline and her father, Margaret's father as well. This is her birth father, who at the beginning of the story, she's convinced basically sold her to prevent a war. And whether or not that's true, you'll have to read the book. But she is convinced of that. So she doesn't want a relationship with her birth father. She thinks that the guy who raised her in the Amaskan order is her father, and she doesn't need this other family over here. But as she's going through various events, she starts to gain relationships with these people that she's never known, but are her birth family. This was very similar to things going on in my own personal life. My mother was never a part of my life, and she was a heavy drug user for a very, very long time. And around the time that I was brainstorming and coming up with ideas for this book, she walked back into my life and wanted a relationship with me. And I was of the mind that I didn't need that side of my family. I'd never known them for 40 years. What did I need them now? Um, and we tried to make a go at it. It unfortunately did not work because she was still using drugs and kept that from me. But, I gave it a go. And so a lot of my own emotional thoughts and feelings about found family versus birth family and so on made their way into these relationships because I was intimately going through something similar. I
Yes.
understood what Adelei felt to suddenly have this family thrust upon her that she didn't really want. And, what was that going to look like? And did she need to have a relationship with them or not? And so there's a lot of that conflict in there.
So, Miss Raven, how did you use symbolism or recurring motif to deepen the narrative of Amaskan's blood?
Sure. Well, I was a former English major, and I was also an English teacher for a long time. So I'm all about, oh, look at Charles Dickens and all the symbolism he intended, da da da.
Yes.
I'm good at teaching that. But, it's weird when you're writing a story. I don't know that authors really think so much about that in very specific things. Like I did not set out to be like, oh hey, I'm gonna make this really important symbol in this chapter and so and so and so. But as you're writing, symbols happen. I think thematically, again, family is a key, you know, component of the story. Um, but when I was trying to figure out how Amaskans separated themselves from the rest of the world, I wanted them to have a tattoo at the base of their jawline. And I was trying to think of how I wanted that to look. What kind of symbol did I want? And I ended up creating just a simple circle. And it seems so, easy, like a circle on their face. Okay. big deal. But I liked the idea of the symbolism of eternity, of something being infinite. We see symbols like the Ouroboros with the snake eating itself. But on the flip side of that, we see things like the infinity symbol, the 8 turned sideways. The idea that life continues. And I liked the idea that Amaskans, in serving justice, felt that they were giving back to the life force, to the energy that creates. And the idea that even after they died, the good tasks and things that they did lived after them. And so for me, a circle, even though it was a simple little symbol, it meant a lot. There was a lot of depth to that.
So, Miss Raven, Amaskan's Blood is award-winning and best-selling author. What will be your advice for those people out there who want to have or to write like this novel?
I think reading a lot is incredibly important. Back when I started writing, everybody who was writing was reading. But I've seen a trend, at least on social media these days. There are a lot of newer writers out there. They're like, well, I don't have time to read. You have to make time to read. If you're not reading what your contemporaries are writing, if you're not reading the classics of where we came from, our history, um, you're not going to evolve as a writer the way you should. I grew up reading a lot of, Anne McCaffrey and Mercedes Lackey, and, even things like Robert Jordan and the roots of epic fantasy, Tolkien, things like that. But even now, I read the newer epic fantasy that's out there too, because I want to see what people are doing in the genre. What are they doing differently? What's um, being inventive and new, so that I can be like, oh, hey, that's a really cool thing. Maybe I should give thought into, more symbolism or more this or whatever. It's a way for us to learn and get our writing chops in better order.
Miss Raven, thank you so much for your advice. Thank you very much. So, what elements of the story make it unique within the fantasy genre of Amaskan's Blood?
Well, I think having almost solely female point of view characters or protagonists, it can be unique in epic fantasy. A lot of epic fantasy is written by white men, and they tend to focus on male centric stories. I also have a character in this series who is in her late 50s and is a badass warrior. And that's rare. We don't typically see older women who are still fighting fit and awesome and kicking butt. They tend to be retired and grannies. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, it's also nice to see that as well. I also tend to try to focus on characters that are more neurodivergent or members of the queer community in some way. I try to be, equal opportunity for all types of people that walk this world to exist inside of a fantasy or epic fantasy world.
Yes, definitely. So, how does Amaskan's Blood set the stage for the rest of the trilogy?
Well, it introduces you to the main characters that are going to continue through the trilogy. But it also sets the stage for what the Little Dozen Kingdoms are, what that world looks like, and what kinds of larger world conflicts exist outside of our main characters. Because the story is so much bigger than just 2 people or even 3 or 4 people. There's a whole world out there of conflict. And when events that happen at the end of book 1 happen, um, it really sets the stage for the explosion of drama and trauma and chaos that happened with book 2, which is Amaskan's War. And then book 3, Amaskan's Honor, due out later this year, it is kind of tying all of that up to some degree and trying to solve some of those large world conflicts.
Definitely. So, to wrap up our discussion of Amaskan's blood, what message or lessons can readers take away from Adelai's journey and the challenges she faces?
Well, I think to thy own self be true. I mean, really and truly, the main lesson is be yourself, be true to yourself. Don't let anyone tell you who you are or what you believe. You are a unique being in this world and no one is like you, so live your truth.
Definitely. So, Miss Raven Oak, thank you so much for sharing this award winning and best selling novel of yours. We are looking for more award winning piece and best selling novel this year. So, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Sure, again, head over to ravenoak.net and you can find all of my books and stories in various anthologies and so on, as well as links to where to get them. Books are pretty much available internationally. So head on over there, find me on social media, and let's chat.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Raven Oak because if you support her, more award-winning and best-selling novels to come. So, Miss Raven, thank you for your time.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
More to come, people. See you soon.